Welcome back. So how could England potentially overcome France? And has there been any examples in England's recent performances that may well be targeted against France in both the Six Nations and potentially in the World Cup? Thank you for your comments to the last video. Zach asked, are any of the tactics or strategies in England's recent performance that might be targeted against France in the upcoming fixtures? And this got me thinking. I think the way to approach this is to kind of look at what France bring, potentially what England need to target, and then look at kind of were there any examples of that over the last few years. I think particularly you have to look at their coaching structure. I mean, there's been lots talked about Shaun Edwards, but they've definitely improved since he's come into the picture, and how they'd set up defensively. And I think one of the big things that Shaun Edwards has always brought to his teams is around line speed. You know, he puts a lot of emphasis on players working hard off the ball to get back into and to put pressure on the ball. But I think also France, what they're looking to try and do is push teams out wide to isolate them, to ensure that they can actually target aggressively the turnover out wide. And I think we actually saw a little bit of this in the pre-match comments by Rafael Ibanez before the England game, who kind of let on to the fact that they would be trying to target this. And I think similarly, South Africa do this very effectively, and they select players that commit heavily and do actually succeed in that position. So I think England, in order to succeed in games against France, they need to probably initial phases need to be targeted inside. They need to be inside that 13 channel, coming back within. And I think that relies on forwards offering themselves as dominant runners. But again, like I said before, it's not just about running into people, it's about using your footwork at the line. And I think, again, that's why certain selections of certain players are being brought in, because they're doing that. And we saw a little bit from Genge, Billy Vunipola in the Australian tests, where they're not offering themselves just as a battering ram, but actually trying to get beyond the defender. Because if you don't do that, then you make yourself a very easy target to be turned over. I think the important thing is not going wide too early. There is always a temptation with those defences to try and get outside that defensive end, whether it's a big pass or trying to work some move to get outside. But I think the problem is that you then get isolated and turn over from that perspective. I think if the opposition or France are stretched, I think England will then looking to go out the back. I think we saw a lot of this in that first test against Australia. And I think that's where that sort of test was going on. I think saw a lot of Marcus Smith falling into the pocket. I think that the advantage of having both Smith and Farrell means that both players can adopt that. So perhaps the variation is that it's less predictable, because if you have one player always getting the ball, you can track him. But now you've got two players who could kind of take that position up. And I think we've seen that in the game, but we've also seen if you go out too early. So I think in that France game, there is an example where England in the first half go out too early, off first phase, and they get isolated and turned over.
Warm to their task a little here. There's Youngs. Slade this time. Good tackle around the legs from Francois Cross, and yet another turnover from France.
There is examples in the autumn tests where England employed with Slade, they looked to go out the back, but then the variation was putting marching through the hole. So rather than actually the person out the back, I think Smith at the back was there for the decoy, and they shortened the decoy. So there's sort of variations on that. I think for that to work effectively, though, runners, so wingers, fullback, additional runners need to run and offer good lines. And that's not just a sort of standard line outside. That needs to be variations, so cutting back, maybe on the inside. And so I think there needs to be greater understanding from those runners, and they need to work hard to try and get into positions to offer that variation. And that's where you probably have someone like Smith who comes into his own, and that sort of, because it becomes slightly unstructured and it's sort of playing off the cuff a little bit. I think if you put out the back, it does not work, then England need to have a clear strategy on what they're going to do then. Obviously, grubbering behind is often an option, but whether they try to go airily. But I would be quite keen for them to have a clear strategy so everybody knows what's going to happen. I think that, and then it just improves that potential of getting the ball back. and not just kick into the opposition, so effectively sort of falls into a turnover. I think, as I've said, the problem with going wide too early and be tempted to do that is this issue of turnover. And as I say, I think France, similarly to South Africa, target that out wide. They employ people, so Gail Ficker and Dante are very good over the ball. So equally with South Africa, and Delalande are very good over the ball. I think they're selected to do that. They're selected to be aggressive, and that's and wingers do the same. And I think the problem is that England got caught a lot there against France, probably similar to the Lions did against South Africa. I think the other thing with the turnover, which is one of Sean Edwards' sort of ways, is that they compete quite hard at the turnover. I think there's an argument that if you can disrupt it even slightly, that disrupts the nine, and that has an impact throughout the game. Whether the exit's not the kick exit doesn't go as far, or ball doesn't go cleanly to hand, or you just gently influence the game. And I think we saw some of that with France against New Zealand, where they just little sort of 1% in the game that can kind of impact the flow of how the ball then moves through the team. Last thing is that France employ this sort of long infield kicking game. So they choose to keep the ball roughly in the middle of the park, and the idea is to try and put pressure on that team. Now, I think that England, to deal with this, need to employ either two methods, really, two approaches. One is you go the Wales way, so how Wales adapted with it in the Six Nations. So they ensured that they're better kickers. So it was often Dan Biggar was kind of receiving that ball, or at least there to take the ball. And then you have to either kick similarly or more or better, more intelligently. And I think there's a lot of patience with it, because the temptation is sometimes to run out or, go aerially, but not get the distance on it. And so France were always advancing up the field. So I think the important thing is, trying to have a strategy on what you're going to do kicking wise. But ultimately it comes down to skill and execution and kicking better. And I think England in some ways did employ this. This was potentially why there was an argument why they went with Furbank in that France test, because he offers another kicking option and supposedly is a longer kicker. So we need to look at that. I suppose the other option from there is to go aerially and try and have Freddie Stewart chasing that and maybe target the weaker side. So if France, for instance, play Villiers, or if you went with South Africa and Colby, trying to target the smaller man who, they're not bad under the ball, but at the end of the day, if someone's 6'6" who's good in the air, is probably going to catch that ball more times than they are. I think the other option is to approach it like Japan did in the second test against France and just run it back. I think it's a slightly high risk manoeuvre, but again, executed by the right players, could be effective. So you think, Freddie Stewart's very good in the air. Perhaps he's not, known for his acceleration and just open running, but someone like Henry Arundel, for instance, is shown to be quite gifted in that way. So perhaps it's an advantage playing someone like him and, and employing a tactic when necessary. So perhaps when the chase is not on and the chase is not as good from the France team, is then employing someone like Henry Arundel to take on the team and try and create space and overlap. So I think that's the other way to employ it. I mean, generally, it goes without saying that if you're going to be a France team, we need to have parity in the physicality. I mean, that's what we've seen over the last few years. They've brought that physicality. So I think set piece and scrum needs to be, at least equal. If not, we need to dominate that. If not, we'll see what happened. England did against South Africa in the World Cup final. So ultimately, they're my thoughts on how England may target France in the upcoming fixtures and sort of examples that we've seen in recent performances. I mean, there's some brilliant other videos on YouTube from people like Squids Rugby and other coaching people who can kind of go into detail around things that we've seen. But I do think that, England do have a plan. And I do think that there's small examples of where they've been testing it. And as I said in the last video, where they've been treating games a little bit, unfortunately, like guinea pigs, just to test that and get players executing that in a test rugby arena. So I'll be coming back. I'd welcome your comments again. It's really nice to see. And hopefully, if there's any other questions, we can kind of do some videos and answer some of those going forwards. So thanks for listening.